Very excited today to have this conversation with Tammy. We met in 2016 in Australia, Melbourne, so quite a far a long way from me, but also from her, even maybe like a few hours closer, in Melbourne. And it was the International Association on the Scientific Study on Intellectual and Developmental Disability Conference, the World Conference. And we met because we were interested, both of us, in parenting and parents with intellectual disabilities. And there's a special personal reason in the case of Tammy, and I'm really excited that we're going to be able to talk about this today. So Tammy, welcome.
Thanks. Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Yes. So before we started recording, you were talking about sort of like the time that we went for supper after our sessions. I would love for you to sort of like talk to us about your impression of that conference and like meeting everybody and what it did for you.
Great. Well, at the time, I was a PhD student at Chapman University. And when I had originally started out looking at dissertation topics, this particular topic about kind of the experiences of children raised by parents with intellectual disabilities wasn't on my radar. Even though that had been my experience, it just didn't seem like, it's going to sound weird, but it didn't sound like a big deal. It didn't sound like it was a researchable even thing, until some folks said, oh, might be, and started doing some research. And by 2016, I had kind of immersed myself in some of the research, and that really solidified my desire to kind of introduce my story through an autoethnography research study, and as well as to meet other individuals who've had similar life experiences. Because some of what I read at the time, particularly older material at the time, really didn't represent a lot of my experience. In fact, it was frustrating to read. Some of it was like, what? I just didn't relate to it. But then identifying people who were newer in the research, and taking a look at it was like, okay, there's not a whole lot of it, but it was exciting to see. And then when I went to the conference and got to present and see that there's a whole group of people who are really interested in this work. I was telling you that we were around the table after kind of just this informal dinner of the special interest group, and you introduce people by their first name. And so I didn't recognize exactly who I was surrounded by until I started connecting people's last names. And then I was like flashing on all of their research, and I felt like, kind of a groupie. I was like around rock stars who were doing all this research that I had read, and that was really exciting and fun. Yeah. So it was a neat experience for me.
And it's funny because as you were telling this story, I remember clearly sort of like how your face lit up when you realized and you were matching. And I think you even like passed a comment and I was like, oh yeah, I remember when I was, a few years prior, it was me sort of like meeting Gwyneth and Sandy Timchuk and,
Right. It was fun.
Yeah, it's interesting how that works. So you talked about sort of working on a autoethnography. What I would love for you to do is maybe like introduce you and your family, and maybe talk about your childhood, and then we could go into your research.
Okay. Well, let's see. I have a brother and my parents, and I went to an event at one point, and I was kind of explaining about my family and why I was interested in special education as a career, as a teacher and whatever. And they made the comment like, oh, so you are the only disabled person in your family. That's really unusual. And I had never really thought about it that way, because think as a child, even though my mom, dad, and brother all have various degrees of learning challenges, um, I never really identified the disability part. Wasn't something that was in my forefront of my mind, particularly as a child. You have no concept of that at all. You just know that, oh, mom doesn't read very well, she can't help me with homework, that sort of thing. But their formal diagnosis, now I know what that is. That was learning disability, or at the time mental retardation. Now it's intellectual disability. um, we grew up right at that time where my parents lived in a time where institutionalization was still a thing. Thank goodness they kind of were under the radar at the time. And then my brother's life and our life together expands sort of the beginning of the rights of people with disabilities to even be educated. And so we sort of like lived this change, hopefully a positive change, although it's still not necessarily where we would like it to be, for people with developmental disabilities. So it's been really fun in that way to look back at what we live. Now I'm like, oh, okay, that's why that happened or whatever. But as a child, it's just mom, dad, and Tim. It's very ordinary and boring. And so when people became interested in it, I thought, well, why are they interested? I didn't even get it. It was like, there's really not a story here. It's only after I realized that people thought it was odd that you start to beginning to wonder, well, what is unique about our family? They would see it as a negative or a problem. But the only thing I did realize was that I had an aunt who was very involved, and involved to the extent supportive in a lot of ways, but controlling in a lot of ways as well. And so my parents had lost their rights to be the decision making parent for us. And so that was unusual. I didn't question it at the time, but looking back, I realized that took a toll on my family, my parents' relationship, and kind of our, I don't think necessarily the way I saw my mom, but I ended up kind of playing a protective role because she was not always treated well by her older sister, in a rather demeaning way. And it wasn't until I was older that I realized it was because of my mom's intellectual disability that she could do that to her, that she could kind of be victimized in that way. And it's kind of weird because this is someone I love, loved and supported us. And yet there was this tension between being kind of unkind based on my mom's struggles in some ways. But so ordinary, really ordinary childhood in many, many ways, but had that extra layer of kind of contention in a way about who's in charge or who's in control, and my mom having to play more passive role. And my brother Tim also has a more significant intellectual impairment, and so it was really through him that I learned more about special education and began just sort of volunteering and in his events, going to Special Olympics. And my aunt, was my my brother's advocate for school. So she was always the contact person for school rather than my mom, and that decision maker for us, and provided, I think, financially. Obviously, most people with intellectual disabilities live on very low incomes. And so we have that advantage of having kind of an extra support. So I went to private school, which would not have been possible without my aunt's involvement. And of course, Tim went to public school because at that time, private schools, even still, aren't really including people with disabilities much. So those are a lot of things that I remember as a child growing up. But
Okay, do you want to share a little bit about like specific stories maybe that you think would be interesting to us?
Trying to think if there's a couple. I think one of them that is, there's a couple that might be interesting. One is, as I got older, like teenage, then you kind of become more aware of the social norms around things, right? And you begin to evaluate your family against other families that you visit and that sort of thing. And it was about that point that I realized, oh, my aunt is rather ashamed of, or maybe we shouldn't, was told not to invite people over to the house. And there was this feeling of like, it's not okay, or you should not invite people over. And at first I thought, well, my mom's not the best housekeeper in the world. Maybe it was that. But now I think there was more to it at that. In high school, you're trying to kind of fit in and all. But so we just didn't have people over. It was discouraged, and we didn't. And then I began, all along though, I realized that there's a sense of protection of my mom. And I loved her. She was probably the most loving, nurturing mom you could want, which was really interesting because I had these two kind of moms. I had my mom who, would just do the world for you and for anybody. And then I had my aunt who was also very kind and loving, but she had a pretty big temper, and she was, more volatile and a little more unpredictable, actually, but highly intellectual. So it was like you could kind of see the comparison. And then I remember thinking, when you become a mom yourself, which mom are you going to emulate? And I kind of absorbed both moms, but my parenting style, I hope my children think it's more like their Nana, which they, of course, I have 4 kids and grandchildren now. So Nana's a big central part of their life. But I knew that her and my brother particularly would be people I'd be close to, and kind of be potentially being a support to them, and kind of doing some of the things that my aunt used to do, but in a less controlling manner, and just as a support. And so dating, I remember thinking, well, okay, I guess I'm gonna be introducing people to my family. And now I realize, okay, my family's a little bit different. Other people think it's a little odd. And so that he has to be okay with that. And it sort of became this litmus test of who I date, not in a limiting way. And I think it was actually a very beneficial thing to see, okay, what is the character of this person? What are their values, and do their values line up with mine? Which is, that intelligence isn't the be all end all, and who you are as a person matters much more to me, and obviously to my family as a result. But so I, found the right guy. So I'm lucky.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And I'm listening to you and I'm like, if you could like listen to my little voice in my head, it's saying like this, like we need this voice, and we need those stories so much more, because it really strikes at the core of what we see in the research in terms of judgment and stigma and stereotypes, and this ableist preconception where you need to be intelligent to be a good parent,
right.
or to be within the norm, or you need to be an able-bodied person. And so it's very interesting to hear from the children, or from the child, and to sort of say like, my mom gave me a lot, and gave me like warmth and kindness and love, and a lot of qualities that I want to emulate in my own parenting, which I think is a beautiful message, especially because I know, probably I have an idea anyways of which research you were talking about, in terms of this is not the experience that you've had,
Right.
because there are some pieces that are quite disturbing, actually, talking about what it's like to be a parent. And it's not to negate the experiences of those children, but it's to sort of say like there's more than just one story
Yeah.
that's important. You were talking about sort of your aunt and your mom and their relationship, and I just wanted to ask you some questions around that, because there's, one article that I think that a lot of people actually cite and quote and mention, which is like the mother behind the mother. So do you want to expand a little bit more in terms of that relationship between your aunt and your mom, and had that played out in reality? Like, how did your parents, for example, lose custody? Well, not custody, but sort of like parenting rights and.
Yeah, that's an interesting story, and there's some mystery around it a little bit. But my mom, as a girl, gosh, this would have been in the 50s, went to a class for the title of the class. We even had a little paperwork on it. Is the class for retarded children. That was the name of the class. And my mom reflects back that they didn't teach me anything. They just let us color all day, And then you fast forwarded, my mom's mom died. My grandmother died when she was 12. And so then she goes to a new place and lives with a sister and in Colorado, and they have no special education, nothing. So she just starts in junior high and high school, and it's a disaster. So she loses her label at that point. There is no label. And then somehow she ends up moving to Washington with another sister who's a little bit just her a little bit older than she is. And they end up finding and enrolling her in a work program with Goodwill. And that's where she met my dad. And she did that for a little while, and then she began a family. And so she stopped doing that. And she stopped having a label. Again, once she moved away, there wasn't any kind of social workers that kind of carry your case like they do now. So again, she was just a woman in the community having children, probably thankfully, right? Yeah. But without any sort of support, she ended up having some medical problems. And my family, of course, wasn't very well to do. So really having good doctors and people to take a look at that and good medical care was a challenge. She ended up getting ill and with a thyroid condition and being hospitalized. And my mom and dad's relationship was a bit rocky at that time, and she had 2 little kids. My brother was just, I want to say 9 months old, and I was 3. And so came my aunt to kind of save the day. And my mom's in the hospital. She was there for 3 months. And my aunt came in from California and basically took us. She kidnapped us, really. And she'll even say that, I kidnapped you guys and took you to California. And my dad was like, what happened? Where's my kids? And my mom, my aunt went to the courts and said, my sister's ill, she's in the hospital. She got temporary guardianship without my parents ever being talked to, called, no signatures, no showing up at court, no, nothing. She was just given guardianship of my brother and I. And one thing I think of now, looking back at all of that and looking at some of the documents, it was called temporary guardianship. But it never became temporary. It became permanent. And I don't know, my parents probably didn't realize they could even contest that. And I don't know if that would have worked or not, if they had, but it in effect operated as losing all, parental rights and decision making. She had papers the whole time. She would give them to the courts and doctors, had full rights as our parent. And my parents didn't. Wow. And they never went to court. There was never an allegation of anything against them, except my mom was hospitalized for that time period. And then when she came back out of the hospital, she moved to California to be with her children
Yeah.
again, and then my dad eventually did as well. But yeah, it was odd. And then when they were reunited as a family, we still weren't they still weren't really in control.
Right.
So, yeah. So I think that contention of
Yeah.
well, whose children are they became an issue. And my mom always felt like, well, I can't do anything that that her sister didn't approve of, or she would lose her children.
Yeah.
And so she sacrificed a lot of what she wanted to do and her ability to make any sort of decisions or live an adult life, kind of, because she wanted to keep her kids and family intact to the best of her ability.
Yeah. That's a pretty big show of love right there and there, eh? To be able to sort of say, like, I don't have many choices, but I'll make sure that I'm there for my kids in the best way that I know how. And it shows also sort of a lot of it's a great representation of a lot of things that we've seen in research, also in terms of, parents with disabilities not knowing that they have rights, or how to fight for their rights, or how to go to court, or the unfairness that can be just in the context of sort of understanding just how the legal system works. In this podcast, I spoke to Ella Callow, who's a lawyer and who's worked, and you probably know her, who's worked in this field for a long, long time. And we talk about that sort of the legal system and how, there's many different structures that are in place that are quite unfair in terms of, parents with disabilities, for sure.
Yeah. It's definitely not accessible for many reasons. One, economically, you have to have resources, or at least that's the view that most people see is, well, I don't have the resources and the money to take anyone into court or to file anything or hire an attorney to be an advocate for me. And not being able to navigate or read that sort of information or know what your rights are was a huge disadvantage. And both my mom and dad feel like, well, she was able to provide these economic things for you, and so we appreciate that. And maybe in the long run it was okay and it was worth it. But it was a cost to them to have that kind of support.
I was wondering also, like, in terms of sort of that relationship, your mom and your aunt, how did it look like in, like, day to day? Were you living with your parents? Were you in the same house as them? Were you living with your aunt and they would come and visit? Or can you describe a little bit what that looked like?
So the majority of my life I lived with my mom in a home that was owned by my aunt, a house. And my parents lived in that home for a few years and then they separated. So my parents ended up getting a divorce. They will both say significantly because of the loss of control over their family and being able to make decisions. And these are decisions like, can we go camping next weekend? No, because the children will miss church and that's not allowed. And so even those simple kind of things. So we all lived in the same community. And I lived with my parents, or then my mom, and my aunt and uncle lived a couple miles away. But they would check in on how we were doing. And often they would also provide transportation, particularly after my dad was no longer living in the home. My mom didn't drive. And so if we needed transportation to church or to school or that sort of thing, then it would be my aunt or uncle who would provide that transportation. So simple decisions about clothing I could wear, what school I went to, if we could miss church or not miss church, or, any kind of, we'd have to get permission to go visit. Any sort of thing was really controlled by my aunt. And then she provided financial resources to us, and kind of paid the bills for my mom, who would struggle with that kind of thing at that time. Again, she was a relatively young woman at that point, and there were no support agencies. She wasn't hooked up with, in our community, we have something called a regional center, which is a state agency that does case management and hooks you up with services, people that can come in and help you, that are not necessarily family, and they're paid for. My mom didn't have those kind of supports, so she was only relying on an aunt to do that kind of thing if she needed it. Now we know that she really probably didn't need it. You could, she kind of goes to pay her bills, now, she just goes there and does it, and it's fine. And she's gained a lot more confidence now that she's kind of out of under that protection of my aunt. In a way, she's learned a lot and she's a very capable woman in so many ways. And then she works around her areas of weakness, just like we all do, right? We just kind of figure out how to get around that thing. But yeah, that was kind of their relationship. Even now, I think my mom holds a lot of the negative feelings about her sister. She's passed several years ago now, but it was a stressful time. But that was our kind of day to day. Was mostly mom. And if something happened where we thought mom was going to get into trouble because something happened, like if we got injured, then my aunt would just come unglued. It was always going to be my mom's fault, even if it was we were playing and we're kids. My brother one time, he had a skateboard in the house, and it went through the sliding glass window and shattered the window. Now, he wasn't really hurt, but it was a thing. And then we would kind of conspire to hide certain things from my aunt because we just knew my mom would get it. So we were co-conspirators in some ways. So
I could see that. I could see how that could happen.
Yeah.
In your story, what I find, amazing, which I think also is unfortunately happens often, or too often still now, is that, your parents didn't sort of like lose guardianship or the control, over you and your brother because of the disability. It was something else. Your aunt was awarded like temporary custody or guardianship, and then it was never returned. And we've seen that also in research where, a mom would lose temporary custody, and then she could never sort of be good enough in, as an example, to have the children return. I wanted to just highlight, there's no questions really, unless you have a comment on that. But to me, that's something that's very striking that we've seen in research, and that's highlighted in your story.
Yeah, I guess my comment to that would be, it seems unfortunately still the case that a label of intellectual disability trumps everything else. It's like people kind of just fixate on that and what they think that means for the person. And until the person can prove all of their stereotypes wrong, they aren't seen as anything else but intellectually impaired. And I think that, wow, are we missing out on so much of humanity and, really those relationships with the people, and maybe over provide support, over control, over minimize their capacity when we stereotype folks and just pigeonhole. And most of the time that is based on what, special educators or other people have written, psychologists have written about intellectual disability, not really through relationships with people with intellectual disabilities either. So that medicalization of the category becomes hyper focused on, versus who they are and what their gifts are.
Yeah, definitely. You speak a lot about your relationship with your mom and with your aunt. I don't know, would you like to expand a little bit on your relationship with your dad?
Sure. So my dad, let's see. So my dad continued to live near us, but his visitation was restricted by my aunt. And so that became frustration. And to him and to us. So we saw him a couple of times a year growing up until I was 18 and in college. And then we kind of really rekindled our ability to see each other. And this is going to sound, I don't like to sound dramatic, but there was a point where we all kind of were liberated. So Tim, who's 2 years younger than I, he has an intellectual disability. And so there was a point where he was turning 21 and kind of going to be coming out of school. And my aunt wanted to become his legal conservator for him, then that would be lifetime. And by that time, I knew that was a very bad idea for him. And of course, at that time, there was all kinds of possibilities for Tim. He was in a work program at school. He was doing supported employment, making money even while he was in school. It was an awesome program. And supported living was an option for him as well. Not group home, not, living with family eternally, and all of that kind of stuff. But my aunt was very, very protective. And so he didn't really have an opportunity to do a whole lot. And that by that time I had become, I was 20, maybe 22. And so, I don't, again, not to be dramatic, but I can't underestimate how big a personality my aunt was in our life. Not just in ours, but like in our church. I mean, she was just a very, very strong woman. And there was a lot of fear of her, even as a grown-up. But my dad helped pay for an attorney for me. So I went to court kind of preemptively and asked to be my brother's conservator. Not that I think he needed a conservator, but I was for sure that he would be granted conservatorship by my aunt, who was moving in that direction. And she did petition to be co-conservator, and that was not approved. So I think it's interesting. Again, the whole court thing was scary, even for me. I don't have a disability, but it's intimidating. It's a very scary situation, and to go up against a family member, it just was awful, and I didn't like it, and I loved my aunt. But they of course deemed, yes, Tim should have a conservator. Okay, that could have been an outcome. He doesn't need a conservator. That'd been beautiful, right? Yeah. Of course that didn't happen. Yes, he does need a conservator. And then a couple years later, when they come out and they look at how he's doing and they check the conservatorship, and they did grant conservatorship to me, so I have been his conservator, all these years. But they come out and they look and they go, he's doing so great. Why does he even have a conservator? I'm like, I don't know. You tell me. You want to undo it? Because that'd be lovely. That'd be great. Yeah. It's there on paper, but I'm not philosophically wanting to control anybody's life, for sure. But we all kind of became liberated, I guess is the point. And then I was able to see my dad, and my children had a relationship with dad. He then lived in Arizona. on a farm. So it was really great to go visit him. And just a couple years ago, he passed away. But we got to know him much better as an adult than I did as a child. So
I'll ask you one more question about sort of your life, and then we could move to the research. I was just wondering, how did your parents' parenting sort of maybe influence your own parenting? I mean, you mentioned you had 4 kids. Do you think that there's you know, an influence, and what it is?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess that my mom was more, I guess I had both extremes. My mom was probably more passive, permissive is more of a better word. And my aunt, the authoritarian kind of, where everyone's afraid, you know, you'll definitely get that spanking or you'll get screamed at. So I guess you know, kind of the middle of the road in those regards, but lean into kind of wanting to understand my children. And my mom was accepting no matter what. If I wanted to be a teacher, awesome. If I wanted to be something else, that was great too. And the freedom to just kind of be open and honest without fear of, I don't even think I could, what could I do that would disappoint my mom? I don't know. I guess I could, if I was a mean, terrible person, she would be disappointed in me. If I was extremely bossy or something. But other than that, she just takes people right as they are. And, you know, most people assume when I talk about my mom that I've helped my mom, right? And yeah, that's the truth. But when I was a young mom, I was also a working mom. My mom didn't work. And so I think that was a great benefit to me as a child. You know, she was always there. If I needed her, she was there, you know, it just this presence. And it was a really great thing. So I didn't have that ability. I worked outside the home. And so my mom began to live near us, next to us, and was our kind of built-in babysitter. She took care of all my kiddos. And then when we bought a house, we thought, well, we kind of like having her near and having that built-in support. And so we purchased a home that had a mother-in-law quarters, and she's lived, you know, with us and in my children's lives their entire life. My oldest is 30. So, but it's been this lovely reciprocal extended family experience that I don't think my children would be the same without. And if you ask them, they certainly, you know, Nana is kind of could do no wrong in their minds too. Just this consistent, loving grandma. And what a wonderful, beautiful thing. So now she's aging. So, you know, it's a whole new thing. But you know, but it's been a really, really beautiful and nice thing. And people always assume, oh, it's a burden, it's a blah blah. No, it's been this. It's nice to have another woman in the house, you know, that you get along with well, and it's just really, really helpful. And my mom has always been an extremely hardworking woman. You know, she'll just give the shirt off her back or do so much for people that it's been a great asset to have her and, you know, kind of be that extra mom for my kids.
Yeah.
Too.
I love how you speak about your mom. When you light up, your voice lights up. And she sounds like a very loving and kind woman. And
she is.
Yeah, and you're very lucky to have her in your life.
I am, for sure.
Do you want to talk now to just sort of transition? So you have had those lived experiences, obviously, like all your life. How did you end up sort of like doing the auto ethnography? And then you also met other children of parents
Mhm,
with intellectual disabilities, and how did you meet them, and how those
mhm.
conversations were when you actually met them and interviewed them?
Yeah. Okay. So as I mentioned, it was through my PhD program that I began reading literature, and some of the literature was old, or was about the time that I grew up, and so there was really not the voice of children present. It was really just the authorities talking about the dangers of the risk factors for children and those kind of things. There wasn't some of that. There wasn't really even an advocacy for parents. It was just kind of, written in a very negative tone. Um, but as I began reading, I thought, well, this has been my experience, and it's different than what I'm seeing in the literature. But is our family just kind of the odd one? Is this or and I didn't know other people who were raised by parents with intellectual disabilities. I knew one other woman who worked for an agency that I did, and her experience was more similar to mine. So I thought, well, that would be an interesting research um, project to take a look at. Maybe our family is unique. And so I reached out to our regional center, which is the case managers, and asked if they could help me find families and adults, because I really wanted to look at kind of that retrospective, looking back now that they were adults. How did they view their childhood? How did they view their relationship with their parent and the supports they received, and all of the things that we just talked about? And so I was able to find 4 other individuals who agreed to do, many, interviews with me and share. And it was so much fun. I've always loved to hear other people's stories. And I did a lot of work with people with intellectual disabilities, setting up their homes, or with families setting up supports for their children, their adult children. And it's just so fun to hear. And I'm always amazed at people's openness to share. And I found the participants that I worked with, and they varied in age range, because still in the US, at least, I read things in other countries, and it appears as though there is more freedom for people with intellectual disabilities to have children. It's still pretty rare in the US to even think about people with intellectual disabilities getting married or having a family. Is almost this taboo, terrible thing to even mention, because goodness, how do we do that?
Yeah.
That kind of thing. So there wasn't that many, but was able to find 4 in our general area, and and they were, let me try to think, they were all supported by a particular agency that was doing very family-centered supports. One of them, is that true? No, that's not true. 2 of them were supported by one agency, and the other one is a sister who was older. She was in her 30s, and the family didn't have any support for a time besides grandma. So that sounded, more similar. And then as they also had a brother with autism, and so as he came through school, they got connected with the regional center for the first time and began to get supports through something called in-home support services in the US. So again, one person who only had family support, and a couple people who had pretty creative family-centered supports. So they range from age 30 to their 20s. Most of them were, 3 of them were just kind of starting out their adult life and in college, and one of them was in her 30s.
Right.
So, and I just loved hearing their stories. They're very open with me, and as they were talking, you're trying to kind of bracket your own thoughts. You're listening, and thank goodness for transcription. But you could see, yes, I can relate to that. Yes, I understand, these things, this idea of each of them talked about their moms as moms,
Yeah.
not really as people with intellectual disabilities. I mean, they obviously saw their parents' limitations, and many of them knew that they had these supports and they needed some supports. And one of the participants actually lived in a group home with his mom and some other children and moms at the time. So he realized, okay, this is different, that we're living in this kind of communal setting than other families. But it was interesting to find the common threads that we all had, was that the relationship sort of trumped that label, that sense of protectiveness of, we're going to be there for our moms. We look forward to our moms being grandmas and relying on them as grandmas. And they all had a view of a long-term relationship that was really positive with their parent. And I love one of the persons. She goes, "Yeah, my mom is ornery sometimes, but she never attributed that orneriness, and that was her personality." She goes, I remember how she put it, but I won't say what she said. But she goes, "But my whole family are sons of, whatever." So that's just how we are. We're very loud and we're very, whatever. And so she didn't attribute that to her mom's disability in any way. Yeah. And didn't give mom any slack for her disability either, so, which is great.
Yeah.
But you saw some common threads of the support was important, appropriate supports. They all had some sort of scare about custody, all of them, except the one family who was had a dad who lived in the home who wasn't disabled. Okay. Until that dad became disabled, but then by that time the older daughter was grown. So the issue of custody was common. The issue of positive supports was an important role. When they lost that support or there was a transition, it caused stress on the children, obviously, as they were made anxious a little bit about what would that mean. And one of the families, it meant as the grandma died and there was no paid supports, that they stepped up, became, kind of the parent, and parenting the oldest daughter became the parents of the younger children. Right. So, which you see in families without disabilities as well, sure, where there's a single parent and dad's working or something like that. But there was just a sense of, each of them had a sense of resiliency as well. Like they saw something about their life experience as being positive, sometimes hard, sometimes stressful, but making them better people in a way. So their outlook was very interesting to me. And I loved their quotes. I mean, just which are in the article. It's my desire to put forth their words as much as possible, because I think you can't even do it justice otherwise. It just, when you summarize, you don't get it. But some of the things that I've seen about the study that I did that's different though from some other studies, is where there was support, it was consistent support. It was either family driven or it was family centered. And the two participants who worked with the same agency talked about the same actual direct service staff being consistent for long periods of their life, which isn't always the case in that field. Often there's a high turnover. But I think because it was a family-centered agency, the employees themselves become invested, and stuck around and really appreciated the family well. I think of what else.
So in all of those, you started by saying, like, I wanted to know if my family was unique in comparison to what you had read. What would be your answer now that you've done this? Is your
I
family
don't think
unique?
it was very unique. I don't. I don't. I mean, at least the other 4 participants shared a lot of the same experiences that I shared. Um, um, and a lot of the danger and anxiety wasn't based on the parent's intellectual disability. It was reaction to that,
Right.
or the custody issues, or the, you know, and even when they talked about, well, we end up having to step up and be more responsible in some ways, because I think there's a theme of that where the children take on a little more responsibility. Not that they become the parent, because I didn't see that in any of our stories, but they take on, oh, they can drive now, so they're going to drive the family around. They can go to the doctor and kind of explain things, or go to the school if they have younger children or younger siblings, that kind of thing. They saw that not as a negative.
Right.
At the time, it might have been a bummer when they were kids, but looking back reflectively, they think, no, that kind of kept me on track. That taught me how to be an adult and give me confidence in my ability to do things, and not, fool around and get into trouble.
Yeah. And I think also what's important in working is to always sort of put it in context, meaning, like, my sister is a single mom. She has 4 kids. She works full time. So yeah, for sure, her eldest will sort of babysit probably more often than my son, who's a single child who doesn't have any siblings to babysit.
Right.
So it's sort of like, within a context and within sort of like all families, I think that depending on our circumstances, we have to step up or not, at different times, because of our living circumstances, because we're a family, and as a family members, sometimes we all need to chip in. And I think it's unfair to sort of say, well, they've had to step in because of the disability. It was probably more about the context, not the label, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And even like being kind of a, when we talk about, sometimes I would make phone calls for my mom and get the information from a doctor, or, send that prescription over to the pharmacy or whatever. That's not any different than some of our families who come where the kids speak English and the parents don't, and the child becomes the translator, kind of, or that go between for second language families. So it dawned on me, like, that's pretty much the same, as my experience. And we kind of don't, it doesn't carry the same stigma, though, as an intellectual disability does, but it's similar.
Yeah.
In a way. Yeah.
So if we were to turn to the future a little bit, what is something that you would like to see happen or be done in research in this field in the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years?
If I had a magic wand and could just change people's perceptions, I think it's not just with folks with intellectual disabilities or parents, but I think it even starts in our schools. We still hyper focus on the label and medicalization, whether you're a doctor or you're a special education teacher or you're a social worker. And until we address the stigma around the label of disability, we need to shift our whole thinking in a way. And I know that is gradually happening. I hope it's happening. That we begin to see people as people, not as separate people or semi people because of some particular label or characteristic that they have. you know, I mean, it would be the same if you're talking about, oh, the poor, the, you know, whatever, the immigrant, the whatever, these classing of people in certain ways that make them different than us. But it particularly is a problem with folks with intellectual disabilities, that we value one kind of being, and quality of the being, versus recognizing, you know, the disposition of people, maybe the most important characteristic of them, not, you know, whether they can read Shakespeare or even help their children with homework. You know, like there should be and could be other people that can step into that role. But so there's just a shift, I guess, in our field. We would call that the social model of disability, right? Looking at really analyzing what we're doing, not focusing only on the person, but what are the supports doing to make their job harder, their life harder, their children's life harder, and what can we do to make it easier by asking them, by, you know, being a partner with them, not superior to them, you know, would be where I would like us to go. And if that shift of thinking happens, it potentially could affect education, our legal system, our social workers' views, but to see families as an asset that needs to be supported, maybe not, maybe they're doing just fine, just leave them be, but and be more of an advocate for them versus a control for them, making, like you said, paperwork, you know, is just, that's not going to be their thing. Yeah. So, you know, or sometimes time management isn't their thing, you know, like making, okay, you have to schedule an appointment that's 3 months out. That falls off my radar sometimes, you know. So what can we do to support that? You know, and address some of the issues around poverty and inequality in those areas as well, which obviously becomes a risk factor, in my opinion, greater than having intellectual disability does, or could, depending on your community and the supports that are there.
Poverty comes back so often in research in terms of being the biggest risk. So yeah, poverty is huge. I think I would add, like in listening to you, I would add sometimes, you know, as professionals, as researchers, as people who do not have an intellectual disabilities, to just be humble a little bit more, because we all struggle for different reasons. We all, you know, like,
that's right.
And so it's not because of our intelligence, or, you know, it doesn't protect us from making mistakes, for doubting ourselves, for struggling sometimes. And I think that if we view sort of parenting as probably one of the toughest jobs that anyone can do, but it's like anyone, because parenting is just difficult, and that's like, you know, what it is, but it's also very beautiful. And I loved listening to you, to your story, to, you know, I felt and I heard all the love that you have for your mom, for your dad, for, you know, what they gave you and how they made you. I also felt the love from your aunt, even though, you know, it's a little bit more complex, but I really thank you for sharing this part of your research. And, you know, I think that this is how we hopefully change opinions, and, you know, by sharing stories like yours. So I really want to thank you for the time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to share it. I appreciate the opportunity very much. And hopefully we'll get to do other stuff together too.
Yes, I would love that very much.
Good. Thanks.
Thank you.